All right. There's an awful lot in the Trump situation with Comey that looks very much like Watergate. But to see the connections, you have to see that cultures have organizations have cultures, that organizations have strategies, and that understanding people is a disposition that we all have to be more suspicious or less suspicious, and that will make a great deal of difference too. But you're going to see them looking a lot alike. All right, Watergate, 1972. I don't know, about 6 guys who were part of something called the Plumbers. They were called the Plumbers because Nixon was obsessed with leaks. Anybody else you know that's obsessed with leaks? All right. They were out there to plug the leaks. To plug the leaks, they had already broken into the psychiatrist's office of a guy named Daniel Ellsberg, who had released a big Pentagon study of the Vietnam War because it showed that there was a lot of lying about it. They wanted, quite frankly and explicitly, to steal the psychiatrist's files and use them to humiliate Dan Ellsberg. These were a pretty classy bunch of guys. What happened immediately afterwards was that Nixon got together with his counsel, John Dean, and with others, and he immediately leaped, for reasons that I don't understand, to the defense of the 6 people, although he hadn't been told that they were going to break into the Watergate. He did know that they had broken into Ellsberg's psychiatrist. They broke into the Watergate Hotel in order to find evidence against a man named O'Brien, who was the head of the Democratic National Party. And they thought they could use that. They also placed bugs in his office so they would know what Democratic National Party was doing. To be fully sympathetic, you have to understand that Nixon was running so far ahead of the Democratic Party, so far ahead of McCarthy, who was running against him, that it was unimaginable that this would do any good. It just couldn't do any good. Nixon ended up winning every state except Massachusetts in the election in the fall of 1972. Okay. Nixon met with Dean and his chiefs of staff, a man named Haldeman and a man named Ehrlichman. And he said, and he quickly said, who are these guys? Well, there are people. They are part of the Plumbers Union unit that we set up. And Nixon said, well, what can we do to get them out? And the answer was, with enough money, we can get them to keep quiet. That's more important than getting them out. And with enough money, maybe we can get them out, too. He started almost immediately a cover-up of the people involved in the break-in. He wasn't involved. One great mystery is why he did that, why he stepped out in front and took it on himself. It soon became clear to him that he was involved in an obstruction of justice and that he could be prosecuted for that. And so he started a cover-up of the cover-up. He started to develop a set of stories and evidence and people giving accounts that pinned the cover-up on his general counsel, John Dean, rather than on him. Okay. Nixon was widely distrusted in the country. He had done a lot of things. Besides break-ins, he had bugged the telephones of all his National Security Council staff. He had tampered with a big antitrust case in order to get contributions to the Republican convention. He was quite capable of being very ruthless and very illegal. Soon, John Dean became aware, John Dean, the counsel, that Dean was going to be treated as the person who should be prosecuted for the cover-up. And what happened to Rod Rosenstein? Rod Rosenstein became aware that he was the person who was going to be treated as responsible for firing Comey. These things, there's some kind of pattern going on here. They can't get traditional ways of covering up out of their head. Okay. It was clear that John Dean did not feel like going to jail, and he announced that he slowly came to the position where he would not take the blame, and where he told the prosecutors and the Senate committee that if he was granted immunity, everybody reading about how the difficulties that immunity presents for a special prosecutor. Bob Mueller has to worry a lot about the Senate and the House giving immunity to people like Flynn, because if they give him immunity in order to get their story in the press, he cannot be prosecuted for anything he said, anything that might have come from that story, and he'll be off of Mueller's list. Okay. Now, strategies. I said people have to have, organizations have strategies. The first strategy of Nixon was a familiar one. It was to pin it on John Dean, pin the break-in on John Dean. And when Cox became appointed as special prosecutor, though Mueller has now been appointed as special counsel, very much the same thing, to try to undermine trust in the special prosecutor. Do you think people will try to undermine trust in Mueller? It'll be a full-time occupation of a very large number of people. Okay. At the first stage, he tried to pin it on Dean. He tried to undermine trust in Cox. He tried to hide evidence, all to cover up his responsibility for a prior cover-up, which he hadn't any need to get into in the first place. All right. Cox had a strategy. He by now had been appointed a special prosecutor. He was a professor at Harvard Law School. He was Solicitor General before then. His strategy was to use the great armory of tools that prosecutors have, make a deal that if Dean if Dean gives testimony against whoever he says did it, then we won't prosecute Dean. Go to a grand jury and get the grand jury to order Dean or Haldeman, senior official of Nixon's, or Ehrlichman, senior official of Nixon's. Order them to produce documents. All the while, Cox was playing it very straight, which is the right strategy, because what he's going to need at the end is to be trusted more than the president. And this is the president who's about to win. I don't know how many states we had in 1972, but I guess we had 50. He's about to win 49 states out of 50. And it's going to be hard to get more trust. But you're going to lose trust if you play tricky games. Nixon was called Tricky Dick Nixon. That's what people would call him. And Cox was never called Tricky anything. When he was first appointed, Nixon said, "I'm awfully glad they appointed Cox. He's rather dumb." Haldeman said, "This guy's a loser. He's going to lose the files." I hate to say it, but these are certain prejudices against professors, of all things. He'll lose the files and he'll never be able to make a case. And Ziegler, who was the press secretary, said, "This guy is just our dream. This is what we wanted." Cox went ahead, hired, with the help of Jim Vorenberg, 2 deans before Martha, and put together a group of about 70 or 80 lawyers. Mueller's going to put together a big team, I think. There'd be a very big team. Cox put together a team. He divided them up into the subject matter. This one's got the ITT fixing an antitrust case responsibility. This one, I headed the team that was responsible for the break-in on Daniel Ellsberg, psychiatrist. The lawyers who were thought to be most capable handled the team of dealing with the break-in at the Watergate Hotel. There were about 5 or 6 teams. He also was cheating in terms of campaign financing and something else too. Okay, so they're sitting around, Cox using all the tools of a prosecutor, Nixon doing everything he can to undermine the prosecutor, hide the evidence, and build confidence in himself and undermine confidence in Cox. Cox is just going ahead. And then one day, a guy named Butterfield, about 3 months after Cox was appointed, is testifying before the Senate. Sometimes it's a good thing if you have Senate hearings, House hearings, and a prosecutor. Sometimes it's bad because somebody gives immunity who shouldn't. Butterfield was testifying before the Senate committee, that means the staff, and somebody asked him, "Mr. Butterfield, were any of these conversations taped?" And my God, he answers yes. He just hasn't been trained. He tells the truth. And now it's known that Dean, who's saying it was Nixon, and Nixon, who's saying it was Dean, can't both be correct, and the tapes are going to show who's correct. Well, this changes Cox's strategy completely. He's now got to get the tapes, and he's got to get it by a subpoena from a court, and Nixon's got to comply. That starts to worry Cox a lot. He's enough of a professor that he's worried what will happen if Nixon doesn't comply. What if I win the case all the way to the Supreme Court and Nixon says I'm not going to comply? The court will not have any more power over the president. The court will have to recognize that the president either complies or doesn't comply as he wishes, rather than because of the order of the court. Cox is getting worried about that. And Nixon is coming up with this wonderful little gambit that I just love. Nixon thinks there's a bright side to the fact that that tapes exist getting out, because before that everything he did to defend himself made him look more guilty. It made him look more guilty because he was trying to defame the prosecutor and hide evidence and everything else. Now that it was known that there were tapes, if he could convince the Supreme Court that there was executive privilege and national security privileges that allowed him to withhold the tapes because a president's privacy is so important, particularly at a time of a Middle East war, which there was, a Vietnam War, which there was, détente with China, which there was. A president's privacy is very important. If he could convince a court of that, then he wouldn't be in the position of looking like somebody who was hiding the evidence. He would be looking like someone who was in a high posture of protecting the powers of the president. And so he shifted to the position of, I have to protect the powers of the president. And Cox shifted to the position of, we'll be very careful not to interfere with those powers. We'll just ask for a few tapes. That was Cox's position. Okay. Well, it would be a little bit better for Nixon if he didn't even have to go to court, because he might lose in court. He had hired by this time Charles Wright. Did any of you know who Charles Wright is? Together, civil procedure, together with Arthur Miller, great expert in civil procedure. He hired Charles Wright, and Charles Wright said, you're going to win in court. They're never going to tell you that you have to turn over tapes that reflect on the privacy of the president. He sort of believed that. He also saw that if he did win, he'd be pretty home free, because he would be able to say, I am protecting the powers of the president. All right, I got to bring this to a close. He took that position, and he took it to, he went with that position to the House and the Senate committees, and he said, I can't, in decency to the presidency, turn over tapes. What I can do is I can make a transcript of the tapes. I will have somebody type them all up, and I'll eliminate whatever bears on the national security or the necessary privacy of the president. I'll eliminate all that. And he said he knew that people might suspect that he would also eliminate anything that incriminated him. But he said, you know, there's a senator that, we're about the size of a Senate on an average day. There's a senator that enjoys immense respect here. That's Senator Stennis, who's my very good friend from Mississippi. And he said, the rumors of Senator Stennis having gone deaf are greatly exaggerated. He was deaf as could be. He couldn't understand a word. And he said, what I propose to do is I will make a transcript of the tapes and give the transcript to anyone who wants it, but give the tapes only to Senator Stennis, who will be able to see that I've eliminated only innocent material and that I've only been protecting the president. Poor Senator Stennis was 90 and couldn't hear it all. And there he was, listening to tapes, or about to listen to tapes. I don't think he ever listened to any of them. But then he had one more good idea. This is a very clever cover-up. He had one more good idea, and that was to get rid of Archie Cox. Sound familiar? It's like getting rid of Comey. Get rid of Archie Cox, and he would do that by convincing the Senate committee and the House committee that it was a very wise compromise to keep as much of the president's powers as he had kept by turning over only edited transcripts, not the originals, and yet to give something that Senator Stennis would warrant was the real thing. And if Cox said no, I want the real tapes, Cox had by then won in the district court and in the Court of Appeals the right to get the tapes. If Cox said no, Cox was sitting there worrying. I was with him then. he was sitting there worrying about what would happen if the president didn't go along with the Supreme Court. But he demanded the tapes. And if Cox didn't go along, then Nixon would say, well, the Senate Select Committee, with its Republican leader, Howard Baker, and its Democratic leader, Sam Ervin, both said you should go along. This is a compromise that gives the president what's due him and gives Cox what's due him, the edited tapes that Senator Stennis has gone over. And shouldn't Baker and Stennis agree to this compromise? And sure enough, they agree to the compromise. Okay, there's only one obstacle to the cover-up being complete. I mean, it's a very fancy-dancy thing. The only obstacle is that Cox was appointed. Now, this is not true under the present system involving Trump. Cox was appointed with a guarantee that he could not be fired, provided by the Attorney General. He can be fired by Rod Rosenstein. Comey, the new special prosecutor can be fired. Nixon went to Richardson and he said, you know, there's a place for you on the Republican ticket in the next election, which would have been in '96. But Richardson couldn't violate the oath he'd taken before the Senate and the country not to let Cox be fired for anything but egregious behavior. So Nixon went to the Deputy Attorney General and said, I'd like you to fire Cox, because he too probably could have done it. But he had also sworn that he would not fire him except for egregious behavior. And so they both said no. Nixon immediately fired both of them and asked a distinguished law professor and lawyer, Bork, from Yale, to fire him. And he said to Bork, there's a seat on the Supreme Court for you. These are classy guys. And Bork, I don't think he did it for that reason, but Bork said, yeah, I think you can fire Cox. As a matter of fact, a very famous law professor, Alex Bickel, had written an article saying the president can always fire a special counsel. So they announced they were going to fire Cox unless he agreed not to get any more tapes. Any tapes, not any more tapes, any tapes. Cox did not agree. They fired him on the night of what was called the Saturday Night Massacre, something like October 20th, 1973. And the whole world fell in on them. Nixon had more of the public on his side to continue as president than public against him, but he did on the days before the Saturday Night Massacre, but after firing Cox, it all collapsed. The public wanted somebody they trusted, and they deeply distrusted Nixon. All right. I'm going to quit by just saying how much is similar. Who did Trump try to make responsible for the firing of Comey? Your predecessor, Rod Rosenstein. Was it correct that Rod had done it? No. Rod got a little further into it than he probably should have, but he had not done that. That was the idea. That was Trump's idea and Sessions' idea. Having decided to blame it all on Rod, Rod turned around and appointed a special prosecutor. and didn't tell the president and didn't tell the vice president that he was going to do it. He just appointed a special prosecutor because he felt he could no longer trust the president. And that's where they are now. Step by step, they're very similar. Clinton's had a cover-up. I'm not going to talk about it, but it's much the same. It always involves thinking you have more power to control the truth than you have. It always involves a heavy payment to the public for being secretive about not obeying the rule of law. I think Trump is right there now. Thank you.